like to introduce Monika again. Monika has been in iOS dev for over 8 years, and she's worked in different kinds of teams, from being the sole iOS dev in a company to a group of 10 to 12 iOS developers. She enjoys taking an idea from rough inception to final production deployment. She still loves coding after so many years, and she is thankful about that. It's all yours, Monika.
Thank you. Yeah, sometimes I enjoy coding, sometimes, get tired. Yeah. All right, so let's share. Where is the thing? Here we go. So we're at the final chapter, chapter 16. So we started with all this combined stuff. And then for part 3, the book went over async await, which seemed like, in some ways, a lot easier to conceptualize and see. And then this chapter 16 kind of says, like, how do you sort of combine and async await? And basically we start with an example, and it's always like Peter's favorite example is, searching books, where the search books method returns a publisher of books. So, you pass in a search term, and, as we had seen before, that, it's using the URL sessions data task publisher, gets the data, then it's decoding it for this type of structure, the open library search result, and that gets mapped into just getting these list of books. And then here we're basically using compact map to take this format, which is the open library search result, into a book format. And it's, so it's basically any errors is just return, taking a shortcut, return with an empty book array. And then we have our usual erase to any publisher, because there was kind of different transformations happening to different types of publishers, where you're going to get this really crazy resultant publisher. And this just makes it simple to make it just be an any publisher type. And then he kind of goes like, if somebody doesn't know combine and they kind of look at this, it looks a little confusing, especially if you don't know the syntax. And then he sort of switches to showing it if you were going to use async await. So again, we have our search term, we have our URL, and then here basically URL search, URL session we can call await on it. And then basically once we get the result of a URL session is, of course, a data. And we can then, we could have also, I believe, with the data, right now we're not using the error, but we could have also got that back too. And then here, basically, we're going to take this data, create an open library search result from it. We do a try because it may not be able to deserialize properly. In here, we just return an empty book or an empty array. Otherwise, then we let our, or basically take the books part of the search result and create our own book array from that using a compact map method. And that, at least if you're kind of like looking at it, it's more closer to sort of like a imperative way of looking at things. So it's like following, okay, then you do this. There's just that magic await. So that's the one part that makes this then be an asynchronous call. Otherwise, it seems like you're just doing a sequence of calls like you usually do if you weren't using combine. So basically, he is saying if you got some experience writing and reading Swift code, you'll be able to understand what this code does. Even if you got no prior experience with async await, all the keywords related to async await blend in with the rest of the code, making it kind of a natural to read and understand. Now this brings us to the whole thing of, okay, so is this the end of combine? Because now we got this async and wait, which is easier to understand for developers, and he basically at this point, he doesn't think that it's the end of combine. And he thinks, although at the time that the book was written, SwiftUI is tightly integrated with combine, he's going to go over what that means. And that's why maybe combine is not going away. So one part was this whole publish thing. You guys remember that, when we have a state object and then we make specific, fields of this, view model that's an observable object. If we if we put this property wrapper, the published, it means that if any of this changes and we have declared this view model as a state object, then basically those changes will reflect in the SwiftUI if it's using these particular fields, then the SwiftUI view will also update if there's any changes to that. Now, as we realized in this past WWDC, this format has changed. I haven't actually played on the beta one, but I think it's now called observed and not published. So it's not, and I think Apple is just explicitly not defining it as a combined publisher, although there's still this idea of observing and reacting to change. So that hasn't changed, but it's its own thing right now. So one of his arguments was well, this is already part of SwiftUI, which now it kind of isn't. It's its own thing. I mean, there's no longer a dependency on combine to be able to get, be able to observe these changes and get it. I mean, I'm sure underneath everything, Apple is, implementing something similar to that. It just doesn't have that combined syntax. And then the other thing that combine was used, which I personally think it was kind of cool that, remember when we're typing in the search term, if we're kind of subscribing to the changes in, as the person's typing in the characters, to be able to take whatever is updated and then go and search. There were some really nice features like being able to debounce. So you're not, every time the user is typing the next character, you're not going and doing a search. You kind of wait a little bit, so that enough of these characters are kind of captured before we go and basically do the next part of searching for our books and then taking those results and being able to map our stuff to whatever the result is. So this debouncing was a really cool thing. And it's kind of for the UI. I mean, it may not be that we're actually hooking it up to the server, to getting something from the back end, but the fact that we can sort of subscribe to changes in the UI and be able to kind of sort of massage those results is a nice thing that you get from combine. And then he kind of goes, we kind of review what each of these things were. So there was debounce, kind of, I mentioned before that the debounce operator will only pass on events after there's been like a 0.8 second pause. And this is kind of configurable. You can put different times, but it's nice because the user might kind of like even, modify whatever they're doing, but you don't want like every character that they're typing in, you go and make another search, which would be very expensive to do. And then the other second part was, just like before, we're taking those results, for the search term and then passing it in our search call, which itself returns a publisher. And then there's this switch to latest, because even in this case, when we're kind of debouncing and taking, there could be multiple calls, to basically get the, so there could be multiple publishers for that update. And what we would want to do is switch to the latest. And this is the part where he talks about that. So even though we use the debounce operator to reduce the number of events, we might run into a situation where multiple network requests are in flight at the same time. So we would want to switch to the latest to do that. And then basically when you're switching to the latest, I have to check that, but I think the other two publishers would be whoever was like running, those would be canceled, but I don't know. I have to check on that. And then, basically because at the time that we get these results, we want to be on the main thread because we're going to be updating these fields in the view model. And it's important to update them in the main thread, because changes in them cause changes in the UI, and that update should happen in the main thread. So again, and there's, here we're use the sync rather than assign, because we were not only, updating our result field, but we have a toggle for knowing if we're searching or not. So that, and then this cancellables is that because we're subscribing, we want to make sure that it doesn't like we're actually kind of retaining those subscriptions. And I think, let's see what he mentions in that one. Using the sync subscribe also means we need to store the subscription. Yeah, because otherwise you come out of the method and it's gone. So it needs to be persisting. So, I mean, after doing this entire book, it's still like, it is a different syntax to do this. And, so it always takes a little bit of time to kind of get used to it. And here, he does a similar thing using the async await. So there's this concept of a main actor. And I don't know if you guys recall from last session that we do that when we want to make sure that iOS knows that this particular method should be done when, it should be done in the main thread when the result comes from the asynchronous call. Sometimes you could have done granular thing and say only this part of it do it in the main thread, but if this execute curate, it doesn't mean that when you're actually doing the searching, when you do that would be in the main thread, but it just means that when it comes back, the results will be back in the main thread. And all the stuff here, if you were going and checking what thread it is, this would all be in the main thread. So again, if we were doing it with async, we keeping track of our search task. So, and again, because you could be calling this execute query every time there's a change in search term, you want to take your previous task that you had set for searching and cancel that. And then basically, get your search term. If it's empty, you just return an empty array. Otherwise, you create a new task. And again, this is all like synchronous. So we explicitly, do this task to let iOS know that this is going to be an asynchronous call, and it will come back later on and do the, whatever was following the await call. So in this case, like, searching, and then once you get the result, if the task is not canceled, then you do searching is false. And the result is whatever we got returned. We don't have to go and do anything else. And search books, if you guys recall, was basically returning an array of books by searching for that term. So again, readability, still using published in that previous version. So once result gets updated, then if your SwiftUI view was dependent on that, that would get updated too. And if there was some dependency on this is searching, that would also get updated. And, he talks about that main actor that I was saying that, we want to make sure, since search books is marked as async, the Swift runtime can decide to execute it in a non-main thread. However, in execute query, we want to update the UI by setting the published properties result and is searching to ensure it runs on the main thread. We have to mark it using, so that, when that any updates we're making here, and because these updates should be in the main thread, that entire method is marked as a main actor. Let's see. As a final step, we need to make a small but important change to the UI. Since we cannot subscribe an asynchronous method to a published property, we need to find another way to call execute query. So how do we do that? So we have this execute query, but unlike before, we were subscribing to the result and just updating, like when do we know, when do we call execute query? Once it does its things, we do update the, the publish fields, and, the UI will get updated. But when do we actually, when someone is typing the search term, how do we call that execute query? And this is the interesting thing that, we have a couple of cool things. I think we talked over this like last time too, that to create that search bar, you just have this modifier, the searchable, and then you're passing the text of the search term. So then that magically shows that search bar that you see. And then if this is the interesting part, there's an unreceive modifier. So if there is a, it's kind of, if there is, when this search term gets updated, which it did, then we're basically do the execute query. And let me just, so yeah, it turns out that Apple added a suitable view modifier to the most recent version of SwiftUI on receive. Oh, and inherently there's a publisher there. And the publishers, because this can change. And this view modifier allows us to register a closure that will be called whenever the given publisher events, So it's kind of like search term changes because you're typing in there, it's getting updated. And then when there's a change there, then this task gets run, and that calls the execute query. And then you can see that in this case, if search term, if you keep typing all the time, this is going to get called over and over again. And then this execute query is going to get called. And that's why we had that whole thing about canceling the previous search task. And it's still not very optimal. And this is why he kind of comes back and says, well, it would be a good thing to use a combination of combine and async here, where, we could use that debound stuff, right? And then be able to like modify when we should be calling the search, because this one's kind of is going to happen anytime the search term changes. But is there a finer way to like, to specify when we should be calling it, which we did with that debounds. But at the same time, making these network calls are a lot easier when we're doing this kind of a async await thing. So how do we combine that two things together? And this is where we come with our, and again, the syntax might be a little scary, but it's actually, it's not that bad. So you go back to like, your view model is initializing. That's when we're kind of setting up our subscriptions and publishing. So the search term, we're going to do that debounce thing that we did before. If there is the same for the same like value, we want to remove the duplicates. And then, if we're getting an update, then we want to make this searching true, because now something has changed in search term. We're going to make the searching true so that while, so the UI knows that we're searching. And then here's the interesting part, so that this value is the search term. And here we're kind of calling the async, basically calling our search books using async in a way. And then this kind of future promise thing is that basically what it's saying is that this is, going to happen sometime in the future. Promise is when, if there is a result, this is what it should do. So it should go and, so when, so basically when we have a value, we have a search term, then we're basically going to call this task. And then in the task, do the search books. And if we get a result, we basically, if it was successful, we have the result. And then we're receiving that in the main thread. Again, we do that whole erase to any publisher. And the result of this is that at the end of this, because we just got the result, we're just assigning it to the result of the view model. And then this handle events is that, okay, if we did get something out of this publisher, then we know our searching is done. Now, it could have been that we could have got an error. That's a separate thing. Right now, we're not dealing. But this kind of a future promise thing is something he kind of goes over. Let's see what he kind of says. Yeah, and this was the part, like, we can further reduce the number of requests. So this whole thing about remove duplicates, he was saying that we can further reduce the number of requests by removing any duplicate API. If we're making exactly the same, someone kind of backspaces and then types the same thing, it's the same search term. We don't want to make multiple calls for that. And then he's saying the handle events can be used like when there is a, we're not necessarily, when you call handle event, you just know that there was a change that happened here. So there was some event, and we can kind of leverage that for setting our our flag. And the reason why he's doing all this is because he wants to just get the result and assign it. He doesn't want to do that sync thing where we were waiting, we're subscribing to like, what was coming out of the publisher and then setting those values in the sync. This way, it whatever we get out is the result, but we can use these handle events to know that, okay, something happened. So there was an event that came through by our pipeline, our publisher pipeline, and we can use that. Let's say, and here he kind of goes over how you can basically call the asynchronous method. So let's take a closer look at the code that allows us to call. So we have this publisher, we have this future promise. To call the asynchronous version of search books, we need to establish an asynchronous context. This is why we wrap the call in tasks. So we know that part, that we need, a way to know that this is going to be a task that's going to happen asynchronously. Once search book returns, we resolve the promise that there is, and this is kind of like, there's a promise that there's going to be something, there's going to be a result of this call. And if we get it, then we can basically pass the result to the next part. So we resolve the promise by sending the result as a success case value. If you didn't do that, then basically it didn't know that this is something that's going to happen because it's not going through the whole combined publishing thing. So because in combined publishing, when we have that whole set of like, I'm subscribing to this change and then you're subscribing to my changes, so there is like a whole, suddenly I've forgotten the word, like a chain of subscriptions. Here, we don't have that because we're just making this easy. How does it know that at some point it has to kind of wait to get the result? And this is how you do it. Although it's not initially easy to understand until you kind of get the concept of future and promise, that you're kind of letting you know that it's going to happen in the future, and once there's a result, it will go to the next part. And then here, then he's like, well, this is kind of a little awkward to write, and we can generalize it. So why don't we extend publisher to say that you could have like a call, like an await call, which will go and do again, do a future task of something. The transform is kind of a generic operation. And then once you get the result, you bring it back. And the nice thing about that is that then you don't have to do that whole thing here. You could just do this await and then self-search book. So it makes it a lot more readable than it was when we were, and you could call it await, you can call it whatever that makes sense. And in this way, he's sort of is combining, okay, for network calls, async and await is kind of nicer. So let's just use that. But at the same time, let's take advantage of some of the stuff that we get from using combine for the UI events. And so then, he kind of goes and summarizes all that he sort of went over, that combine is a reactive framework with the notion of a stream of events that you can transform using operators. And the side effect free way of programming makes it easier. Of course, side effect is, if we're kind of take the result and assign it to something, that's kind of side effect free. But if you're like syncing and you're getting a bunch of events, you could still change other things. So, it is kind of side effect free depending on how you use it. And then await, on the other hand, aims at making asynchronous programming and handling concurrency easier because it's kind of readable, and it just, you're just using these, just letting the system know that this is going to be asynchronous, and it will do the right thing of, kind of stopping. Remember how we talked about, like, it just kind of stops, does other things until we get the result. And then his recommendation is to use whichever of the two makes the most sense in any situation. Of course, for any UI related task, I personally prefer using combine, as it gives us unprecedented power and flexibility when implementing otherwise difficult to implement aspects, right? Like debouncing is a good example. Combining multiple input streams, like there's a bunch of different things that are changing, and you do need to get updates, for all of them to do something else. That would be hard to do it if you weren't doing combine. And the other one is efficiently handling out of order execution of network. Because async and wait, as long as one follows, it's sequential, it's easy to understand. It's harder when you are making multiple network requests for different things. And again, trying to combine the results to do the next operation. Then again, combine makes more sense. And I think for all these reasons, this is why I don't think Apple would get rid of combine, because there's some of these things that you can't get with async await. But they're sort of more uncomplicated. I think they wanted to come up with something simpler for the usual common asynchronous stuff, and then use combine for more kind of sophisticated, complicated interactions. And then again, my recommendation is to use combine for UI related features in your app that needs to deal with handling input from a number of sources. And he gives good examples like input validation, validating multiple input fields, making sure that the user filled in all the mandatory fields, handling interfield dependency. I mean, there's a bunch of things and multiple things that are changing. And usually if anyone has done like form validation, it's painful. Like, do you do it sequential, like the first one that fails, or, can you sort of take all these updates and change, make the user know that if any of these things are not valid, you show the right error. And then if everything is validated, then you can sort of do the final operation. And then searching and filtering, yes, the whole debouncing, making it more efficient to do the searching. And then this thing about cleaning up your user input before it reaches your data. So making sure that you don't hit your API endpoint. Yeah, this is again for the debounce part. That makes sense, that you're sort of like doing some, you're not just passing every change, that there's some modification to the change. On the other hand, you might use async and await to, you might find using async and await easier to use than combine when calling asynchronous APIs, making network requests or interfacing with platforms like Firebase. Because again, it's like, oh, I'm just kind of waiting. And when I get the result, I'll do the rest of the operations. It makes it a lot more readable. So that is kind of the end of the book. It's, again, like everything in the book, there's a lot of content. So sometimes I think it might be nice to kind of go to the code snippets that he gave, and we do have that GitHub, and just kind of playing around with some of this code just to feel more comfortable understanding it. Any questions before I continue on? All quiet on the Western Front.
That's so well.
So I think there was some interest. So we did do some playing around with combine with the other project. And I was just thinking, well, like, what could we do with async await? So one idea I had was, and this is again, because we don't want to do something really complicated, that there's an API for, and I'll put this on the Slack channel after this, but there's an API to find out like what's the, how good the air is based on your location. And it's a, free API that you can call and, so I thought we could do a simple SwiftUI app where, and then someone also wrote a async await wrapper for chord location, which I think is great. And I thought maybe combining, like using what they've done, which means part of it is like understanding how they kind of take, the whole chord location for getting your location and making it be as simple as like awaiting my location, taking that, because if we want to use this API, it needs to know your current location. So can we use that wrapper and then also then do an async await method for getting this air quality thing? And then basically having a very simple UI that kind of shows you, what the air quality wherever you are. So anytime you launch it, and you can be a little creative in how, different colors or whatever for showing how bad the air quality is. So leaving the design all up to you. But just some small project to just get your hands wet. Because usually, what would be the old way of doing it if you weren't doing it? You have to do this network call, you will have a callback, a closure where you're updating things. And then you have to do that sort of painful my location thing of, again, having a callback and, prompting the user for allowing, giving permission to use their location. And it would be good to see if you were doing it with the async await, how much easier it would be to do that. So I'll put the specifics there. And then based on, we could meet next week, I think at 9, because I might 8:30, I might have something, but 9 to go over the project. Or we could do it, through Slack where people, have their project and they want to get comments, whichever way. I'm okay with either way. If everyone feels like in a week they can have the project done, we could have a session to go over it. But this is kind of more of a hands-on thing than like, review.
Yeah, that sounds great. Either ways, we can meet up and discuss some of it.
Yeah,
And
sure. Yeah, that will make me finish it, so that's always good. So I'll but I'm hoping I will make someone else show their stuff. But yeah.
So yeah, like what date are we thinking? Are we thinking of the 29th? Or do you want to do maybe
28th, I think, is next Friday.
28th? I'm looking at the wrong thing. Yeah.
So I mean, we could give it 2 weeks if people feel like they need some time and they're kind of busy. We could like not do anything next Friday, and then the Friday after kind of go over projects, and kind of during that time kind of get people to even like put their code on the Slack channel. So I'm okay either way.
Awesome. Okay, I've set up a Zoom invite. I mean, the meeting. I set it up. I'll switch it to 12 p.m. Eastern. That's one change I'll make. It's on our Beacons page already, so folks want to register for it.
Yeah.
I'm just gonna switch the time. And yeah, that sounds great. And once you share those details with me, I can add all of that information.
I'll share it today with you. Yeah.
Awesome. Yeah. Wow. We covered the entire book. That's amazing.
I know. I put it in my Goodreads that I read it. It's rare sometimes to go through the entire thing, but and it was good. I mean, honestly, this subject like combined is so huge. So many features that, but he tried to do it in the context of what makes sense in SwiftUI, and at least some good examples of how it could be useful. And I think he did a good job with that. So, yeah. All right. Then I hope everybody has a good weekend, and we'll see each other next Friday.
Yeah.
Take
The
care.
Friday after.
Yeah.
All right. Take care.
Bye.
Thank you so much. Bye.
Bye.